You're listening to Let's Talk Creation, the science podcast that's just for you.
Welcome back to another episode of Let's Talk Creation with Todd and Paul. I'm Todd Wood.
And I'm Paul Garner.
And we're here to talk about creation and origins. And this time, literally origins. So some of you might know that Paul and I have been involved in an annual conference event for, 20 years now. It's called Origins. Simple enough. And this was Origins 2021. This was the annual conference of the, originally started out as a Creation Biology Society. Then we added, about 10 years ago, we added the Creation Geology Society. And now this year was the first time we met with the new Creation Theology Society. So it was pretty exciting. And it always is a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun to get together with folks and talk creation and research and ideas and collaborations and all that good stuff. So this year was a bit different. So usually in the past, it's like a regular conference, right? We have a venue and we all go there and we have our talks, and that's how it works. And last year we canceled the in-person event and tried to do it all online. That worked okay. It worked better than I thought. What did you think about it, Paul?
I thought it worked pretty well in the circumstances.
Yeah.
It was an advantage, obviously, for those of us who are unable to get across to the United States. And I guess you weren't able to travel even within the United States at that point anyway.
Well, I mean, we're Americans. We do what we want. But so, yeah, we just thought it was probably better. And the venues weren't really open. It was the big lockdown, and so people weren't really open for business. So, yeah, it worked out that we would sort of try a totally online experience. This year, we were concerned about another flare-up of COVID, and so the president of the Creation Biology Society, Matt McLean, suggested to me, why don't we try a mostly online conference with a couple of places where people could meet in person. And we can have our in-person talks at these venues, and we can stream to the other venues, and people can stream online, and we can have this big, cool technical event that would be totally different from what we've ever done before. It worked okay. Sort of. It was not the easiest, smoothest conference we've ever done, but the online streaming component was a really important thing because it brought in people who could not otherwise ever come, right? We had people from Australia, we had people from Europe, both the continent and the UK. So it was really kind of encouraging and really kind of fun in that sense, knowing that, there were more people there than just the people in the room. So, with the Origins Conference happening, we thought it would be a good idea for us to introduce our listeners and viewers to kind of what's happened at Origins. So, we lined up a bunch of interviews. Turns out more interviews than we can cram into a single episode. So, we're going to stretch this out over the next two episodes. So we've interviewed folks about their research that they presented and what they think about the Origins Conference in general. And I hope it might give our listeners, our viewers, some sense of some little bitty taste of what it might be like to be at the Origins Conference. And hopefully a taste that will be understandable and not overwhelming. I was talking to one of the people at our venue. We here at Core Academy, we hosted one of the venues, And I was talking to some folks afterwards, and they were talking about how technical it was and how difficult to follow it was. And I thought, yeah, that's not something I think about because I live in this world and I talk like this and think like this all the time. And so it was good to be reminded that, sometimes you got to put the cookies on the bottom shelf, as they say. So, with that, Paul, how about you take us into our first interview? Introduce your interviewee.
Okay. Yeah, this is a great opportunity, I think, for us to do a little bit of science outreach and to take some of the topics that, we're really excited to hear about at Origins and to communicate it to a wider audience. And like you say, hopefully in a way that people can understand and get excited about and maybe think about coming to Origins themselves. So what did we learn then this year at Origins? Well, our very first talk of the conference was by Dr. Marcus Ross. He's a paleontologist, as you'll find out. And his talk concerned something called the genealogical Adam and Eve hypothesis, which is basically an attempt by a theistic evolutionist by the name of Joshua Swamidass to reconcile evolution with a historical Adam and Eve. And after the conference, I spoke to Marcus because his talk, I thought, offered some really interesting criticisms of the genealogical Adam and Eve hypothesis. And I thought it was worth others hearing about those. So let's hear what Marcus has to say. Well, hi, Marcus. It's great to have you here with us today. How are you?
I'm doing really well. Thank you, Paul. And it's a delight to be on the program with you guys.
Yeah, it's really great to have you. And I thought we ought to begin with a bit of introduction. Now, some of our listeners will obviously know who you are, but for the benefit of those that don't, I wondered if you could just give us a few words of introduction about yourself.
Sure. So I'm Marcus Ross, and my background is in paleontology. I earned my PhD working on a group of animals called mosasaurs. These are the large marine swimming lizards, and they were truly lizards. If you've seen Jurassic World, you know the mosasaur that comes up at the end of that movie. So I get to study those animals for my PhD work at the University of Rhode Island. Before that, I did a master's degree in paleontology in South Dakota and my undergraduate in Pennsylvania. And I always had kind of these twin passions ever since I was a small child of dinosaurs and the Bible and following after God. So I became a Christian very early in life. And when I was 4.5 years old, I learned about dinosaurs. And so there was just kind of this track that I followed. And it didn't take too long, reading the dinosaur books and reading my Bible to start realizing that there seemed to be some sort of, difficulty with the two, not in concert, not in agreement about the age of things and how things happened. And so that brought me to an interest in the creation evolution realm. And always had an eye for that. So I wanted to be a paleontologist, and I wanted to be able to use those skills and that knowledge to further the kingdom. I taught at Liberty University as a professor of geology for 16 years. And this year in 2021, I stepped aside so that I could pursue full-time work with Cornerstone Educational Supply, a science materials and supply company that my wife and I started a few years ago. So I've been in academia a lot, done a little bit of research and a lot of teaching. And teaching is something that I absolutely love doing. So it's fun to be able to come on a program and be able to share and talk with you and the watchers and listeners out there.
That's great. That's fascinating. And Marcus, you kind of kicked off the Origins conference this year. You gave the very first talk, and it was all about something called the genealogical Adam and Eve hypothesis. That's quite a mouthful. So could you tell us just a bit about what that is and perhaps how it compares with the historic Christian view of Adam and Eve?
Sure, because it certainly sounds like the historical view of Adam and Eve, right? That they are genealogical ancestors, and we look at the Bible and we see Adam followed by a set of genealogies that link, to Noah, to Abram, and on throughout the Bible. So, on the one hand, the name of this sounds rather uncontroversial. The particular hypothesis was presented by Dr. Joshua Swamidass in his book, The Genealogical Adam and Eve, which was published in 2019. And in that, Swamidass takes an approach saying that Adam and Eve were not the first and original pair of people created by God, but rather that they were a specially created pair placed in the garden, or at least that you could believe this. He puts this out as a thought experiment, that God created them as an original pair. And once they fell and were ejected from the garden, their offspring would intermarry into a previously existing population of humans that had come about through normal evolutionary processes. So Swamidas is presenting what he believes is a way to read the biblical text faithfully with a historical Adam and Eve, but it requires that there is this previous evolutionary history where God had created people so that there is this stock of humanity out there for Adam and Eve's lineage to intermarry into. And the idea for this is really to be able to salvage say Paul's statements in Romans and Corinthians that talk about all of us being in Adam, and therefore we are all have Christ's sacrifice and atonement available to us. Swamidas says that as long as the whole world can trace its genealogies back to Adam by the time of Christ's birth and his atonement, then we're okay. Then we can salvage what Paul has to say about these sorts of things. The New Testament can make sense. We can all be in Adam, even though he's not our sole historical parent. He's somebody that we can all trace ourselves back to.
I see. So let me sort of just check that I've understood this. So he's trying to come up with some kind of scenario that harmonizes evolution with the Bible, where we can still have a historical Adam and Eve, a real couple in a real garden, but they are not the sole or unique progenitors of the whole of humanity. They're genealogical ancestors of everyone alive today, but they're not our sole progenitors. I've got that right, have I?
That's correct. So in Europe, there's a story that goes around that says that basically anybody in Europe is a descendant of Charlemagne. Charlemagne, living around 800, he had 20 kids through a variety of different women, and that those kids had kids who had kids who had kids. And so pretty much everybody in Europe can trace their ancestry at some point back to Charlemagne. So that doesn't make everybody a king of the Holy Roman Empire. It just means that, you've got Charlemagne somewhere in there. So that's kind of the idea, that if we could take that from Europe to Charlemagne, move that back so that we get everybody alive on Earth at 1 AD and trace them back to Adam a few thousands of years before that. But again, this is going to require, yes, that there is this outside population of what Swamidas calls people outside the garden. He tries to avoid the historical term for this, which is pre-Adamites, because it has a really bad history in Christian theology, including, having to admit to heresy and recant of that. Isaac Laperriere was the first notable person to propose this in a full form. His proposal was different from Swamidas's. Laperriere was looking to say maybe all the Gentiles came from other people and only the Jews came from Adam. And Swamidas is saying, no, all of us come from Adam, even though we all also evolved through standard evolutionary processes. So he prefers this different term to try and separate himself from the other historical claims of pre-Adamites. But the reality is we're dealing with the same thing. They're just calling them two different names.
Okay. So we've got this sort of population outside the garden. Adam and Eve, or their offspring, kind of intermarry with these other people outside the garden, however we want to regard those people. And thus they become the genealogical ancestors of us all. But they wouldn't be unique in that respect, would they? Because in effect, the way that this works, almost anyone living in ancient times who had offspring would also be a direct ancestor of everyone alive today. Is that right? So they wouldn't be unique in that respect.
That's right. Adam and Eve are simply another one of our universal genealogical ancestors. And anybody further back from Adam and Eve would also be a universal genealogical ancestor. So basically, if you think about it this way, anybody who had children, and so on from 4,000 years ago or before in Swamidas's approach would be genealogical ancestors of us all. Now, with Adam, he wants to imbue Adam with specifically, certain identities and characteristics that God provides. But this is a way of getting effectively the fall into all of humanity. So you have this really interesting problem where you've got all these people that are outside, and he says that they are made in the image of God, because in Swamidas's view, Genesis chapter 1 and 2 are where this hard line has to be split. The people created in Genesis 1 are these people outside the garden, created through evolutionary processes, and Adam and Eve are the ones specifically made by God through miraculous methods. And so in order for this to work, you've got to maintain this really hard separation between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. Adam and Eve can't be the people talked about. Although Swamidas also throws in so many caveats in his book that eventually says, well, they could be. And then the Bible still doesn't mention people outside the garden. So if it doesn't exclude it, then we can have it. So a lot of his argumentation is based on really an ability to find some lacunae, some gap in which we can place these people outside the garden, whether the Bible affirms them or not, as long as it doesn't disaffirm them. He thinks that it's a viable option for us.
So although this idea was sort of put forward as a way to sort of harmonize evolution with a traditional reading of the Bible, actually this scenario about Adam and Eve actually sounds rather different when you dig down into it from the traditional view. In the talk that you gave at the conference, you spoke about some particular methodological and scientific problems with this idea. And I think we've already begun to touch upon some of the biblical problems. What do you see are the sort of key problems that you've identified with this idea?
Well, on the scientific side of things, one of the things that troubled me when reading through Swamitha's book was his reliance on really one key model that was presented in 2004 in the journal Nature by Rode et al., in which they mapped out this genealogical ancestry model, but they did so with the modern human population. So we're not talking about the time at Jesus Christ. We're talking about us, you and me, and saying, given certain parameters about how frequently people have children, how easy it is for them to travel from one spot in the world to another, their very surprising conclusion was that we could have a universal genealogical ancestor of all the people alive right now about 3,500 years ago. So 1500 BC. So you could put it this way, kind of everybody's a descendant of Abram, or so in that case. This model did allow for rather extensive travel amongst the people, and they had to kind of create ports, if you will, where people could move from islands or from mainlands and things like that. And the parameters were chosen for certain reasons, and they might be fairly reasonable, but it's just one model. There was a previous model in 1999 by Chang, but he was also on the 2004 paper. But there was another model that was published in 2016, which makes an appearance in Swamitha's book, and that was a paper by Kelleher et al. And Swamidas liked some of the work in that paper. They discovered what they called a traveling wave function for how ancestry gets passed. But he really didn't like the stricter migration capabilities that they assigned to people. And so in Kelleher et al.'s paper, which is 12 years after Rode et al., and largely kind of a response and a reapproach to Rode et al. With 3 different numerical modeling systems that they tried, they found that you'd be looking at tens to 100,000 year time frame for going back to a genealogical ancestor. Swamidas dismisses this in a footnote or 2 in his book as just being unrealistic and leaves it at that. So I was disappointed that there wasn't more interaction with what the model actually proposed and their critiques of the Rode et al. Model. And it really, it takes Swamitha's idea of placing Adam and Eve in that, 4000-ish BC period, right before the Bronze Age, and says, no, it's got to go way back in the Neolithic period or Paleolithic period, really. And that would make little sense of the genealogies that we have in the Bible as well. You really kind of take Adam and Eve out of typical history of what people are thinking about for this. And so Swamidas just says, no, that doesn't work. And so I was really concerned about that because Kelleher et al.'s models are much more robust. Yes, their migration is much more limited, but it might be more realistic. And they even mention in their conclusion that probably somewhere between Rode et al. And their model might be the truth. So rather than 100,000 years ago, maybe it's 50 or 40, but that's still 10 times further back than what Swamidas argues. So that was one of the main problems that I had here, and one of the ones that I mentioned in a publication at Sapientia, and something that I haven't seen either Swamidas or some of his other followers, if you will, some of the others who agree with him, really come to grips with the Kelleher et al. Data. Okay.
And you mentioned there the Sapientia article that you wrote. We'll link to that in the show notes so that people can read that if they want to. So in effect, what you're saying is that this most recent genealogical ancestry modeling really puts Adam and Eve outside of the time frame that Swamidas is proposing. But it kind of raises a question in my mind, because obviously as young age creationists, we also think that Adam and Eve were created, maybe 6,000 years ago or thereabouts. And don't these models also present some problems for our own position? And, how can we sort of respond to that?
Yeah. And Josh Swamidass brought up that same in his rejoinder to my critique, and said, listen, that's a problem for you. You just defeated yourself. And I kind of think about it and go, yeah, it doesn't look good for us either, except for our models for human origins are very different from Swamidass's, right? With Swamidass's hypothesis here, you've got Adam and Eve, and you've got this massive population of humans outside the garden. They're worldwide. I mean, by 4000 BC, you've got Aborigines that have been in Australia for tens of thousands of years. You've got people who've been in the Americas for several thousands of years, at least, if not 10,000, people all over the globe. So you've got to get Adam and Eve's ancestry to spread out amongst this large, robust population of, at that point, probably 25 million people or so. For young Earth creationists, on the other hand, if we are looking at most of, say, if we're looking at the Neolithic, Paleolithic period as actually post-flood, then we're not pegging Adam in that period. We're pegging actually Noah and his family right before that. It's their descendants that are going to bring about the Neolithic and Paleolithic periods and eventually rework civilization after the fall of Babel and those sorts of things. So our first challenge is actually getting back to Noah, and then after that to Adam. But when Noah and his family come off of the ark, there are no other people. So the models for spreading genealogically through an existing population do not apply when you have a new founder population. Now we're looking at how quickly do Noah's sons and wives populate the world. And granted, we have got some problems and some challenges ahead of us in modeling how that happens within biblical parameters. But our challenges are different. You can't just take the critique against a genealogical Adam position, something that the challenge of Kelleher brings out, and say, well, that applies to young earthers as well. Actually, no, our model is a very different sort of one. It's a founder model. It's not a trickling through an existing population type of model.
Marcus, that's very, very helpful. I wondered whether also you just wanted to say something about perhaps some of the methodological problems of Swamidass's proposal. And in particular, in your conference talk, you talked about the unfalsifiability of Swamidass's model that he claims. Could you just comment on that for us?
Sure. I mean, one of the things about Swamidass's book is that, as I mentioned, there's a lot of caveats that are thrown in. And the way that Swamidass puts together his argument makes it very, very difficult for one to approach it within the parameters and the rules that he's following and come to any means of falsifiability. And that was something that I critiqued in the Sapientia article. For example, on page 12, Swamidass says, so this is right at the beginning of the book, he says that there is no evidence for or against the de novo creation of Adam and Eve. He considers that a miraculous event that is outside the scope of scientific testability. And he says that the claim, this is on page 29, the claim that Adam and Eve, ancestors of us all, were de novo created is neither a scientific claim nor is it a scientific conclusion. In this sense, it's an improper hypothesis. It is, nonetheless, a well-specified hypothesis that science can test. To which, I kind of scratch my head and say, wait a minute, it's not a scientific claim or a scientific conclusion. It's an improper hypothesis, and yet it's a well-specified one that science can test. And I remember reading that paragraph over and over and over again at the end of chapter 2 is a very difficult read to make sense of, because Swamidass keeps saying, like, we can test this, but we can't falsify it. We can confirm it, but there's no way to really analyze it. And so this issue, I referred to it as hedges that he puts up, these kind of mobile barricades of protecting the idea against falsification. And Josh critiqued that, and he said, listen, falsifiability is not what science is about. And Karl Popper, was wrong about falsifiability, and everybody knows that. And Karl Popper was wrong about falsifiability being the distinguishing characteristic of science. Popper wanted to use falsifiability as the demarcation. On this side, not science. On this side, science. And the rule is falsifiability. And Popper, by the end of his career, knew that that wasn't quite right either. But that doesn't mean that as scientists or historians or anybody who is trying to figure out truth, that falsifiability is also all of a sudden something that doesn't matter. The Bible tells us to test things, right? Prophets predictions were to be tested. If they didn't show fruit, if they were incorrect, there were severe consequences for those sorts of things. So we have a reasonable practice of rejecting things when they turn up wrong. It's a good methodology. Yeah. And yes, we can confirm things, and that lends support to a theory. But Swaminatha's approach here is to kind of say Adam and Eve can exist in this lacunae, in this gap, and we can put them there, and science can never tell us that they weren't there. And from there, then I can confirm my ideas, but anything that's disconfirming, that doesn't really count. And that's not, I don't think that's how Josh does science normally. I mean, he's a well-published computational biologist, and I don't think that he accepts models that constantly run into problems if they occasionally, run into a positive. If they keep running into problems, then there's something wrong with the computational model. So this is set up both in the science side of things as well as in the theological side of things. The fact that the Bible never claims that there are pre-Adamites or people outside the garden is something that he can say, well, maybe it can explain some mysteries, but even if it doesn't explain those, the Bible's silent about them so they can still exist. I don't think we want to be putting our faith into things that the Bible is not saying. I think that's probably a bad approach. We're supposed to put our faith in what the Lord God has told us and in what the Lord Jesus Christ has done for us. We rely upon evidential confirmation to recognize that God was truthful. So why would we rely on something that does not allow us to have confirmation or disconfirmation in order to salvage this problem? I think that basically the genealogical Adam and Eve hypothesis brings in far more problems than it could ever provide us with solutions.
So there seems to me to be a whole host of sort of biblical and theological and scientific and even methodological problems with this idea. Marcus, that's been very helpful. I'm sure there's lots more that could be said, but we'll probably sort of draw it to a conclusion there. I did just want to conclude this interview by just asking you about Origins more generally, because you're a regular attender and participant in the Origins conferences. What for you is the value of being part of this this community of scientists, and what would be the value of other people also getting involved?
Tracing back, this conference goes back several decades to the foundation of the work of Baraminology, back when it was called the Baraminology Study Group. And I think I came to my first meeting was in 1999. I was a grad student. We met at Liberty's campus. It was the second of the BSG meetings at that time. And a lot of the folks that started that are, still attending. We've got people like Dr. Tim Brophy, who was there, Dr. Kurt Wise, Todd Wood, et cetera. And to see that morph over the years into a regular meeting that now includes biology more broadly. The Creation Geology Society meets alongside, and now a Creation Theology Society had their first meeting with Origins. Was great. In fact, it was 10 years ago this year that Origins became the title that we started using for this conference when I arranged the meeting out in South Dakota in 2011. And to see the way that this has helped me to develop as a scholar, to sharpen my ideas, to get a broader connection with really well thought out creationists. And one of the things that I really love about Origins is that the presentations, the techniques, the methodologies that are brought out are forward thinking. They're positive in their approach. It's not just about showing that evolution is incorrect in some way, although that's a component of some of the things that we do. Origins has always been more oriented towards how do we solve our own problems in young age creationism. How do we understand biblical kinds? How do we understand the geology of the flood? How do we understand other aspects of the text? How do we teach this well to our students? It's been very broad over time. It's been great as just a regular component of my professional development, if you will, to see students start to attend like I was, and then become more heavily contributing members. And to see that growth amongst there, I think has been great. And I would really encourage anybody to head over to the Origins website and take a look at where the next meeting is going to be. If you're a student, you can join the Creation Biology Society for almost nothing. If we have to do virtual meetings again, we do them, and those become something that far more people have an opportunity to attend. So, I would really recommend that if you are a student in college, in university, that you join up and get access to this great collection of people who are faithful to the Lord and seeking to learn about the world around them through the lens of Scripture.
I wholeheartedly agree with everything that you've said there about Origins, and it's always one of the highlights of my year. I always look forward to it very much.
Yeah.
And but if people are not involved in Origins, students and other scholars, you really need to be getting involved in Origins. You certainly won't regret it. Marcus, that's been absolutely brilliant. Just tell us how our listeners can get in contact and find out more about Cornerstone Educational Supply.
Oh, well, thanks, Paul. So Cornerstone Educational Supply, you can find us on the web at cornerstone-edsupply.com. And Cornerstone is a company that produces and sells science supplies. So if you need beakers and labware, if you need dissection specimens for your homeschool co-op or your college or school, if you're looking for geology kits, that's a particular specialty of ours. We manufacture all of our geology kits in-house. We have over 160 different minerals, fossils, and rock specimens available. So from the very common to a little more exotic stuff, we have a lot there. So we do a lot of work with publishers and homeschool curriculum developers that are looking for a customized kit for their biology class or for their chemistry course. And so those are the sorts of things that we do. And we are thrilled to serve the home education community, the private schools, and the colleges out there. Everything that we do is geared with an eye towards creation and supporting creation. So we're big proponents of Core Academy, one of the sponsors of this program, and the scholarships that they provide to students. So you can know that if you do purchase some science supplies from Cornerstone, first off, I thank you, but we're going to be giving back to help develop creation research through the work of students and their faculty mentors.
That's great. So do go and check out Cornerstone Educational Supply, everybody. Marcus, thank you so much for the time that you've given us today. It's very much appreciated.
Paul, it's a delight. Thank you so much. And you guys have a great time out there.
Well, yeah. So, yeah, that was an interesting presentation that Marcus gave. It's very sort of symptomatic, right? It reminds me of the same sort of things that we've been hearing for years about how we can reconcile somehow evolution or an ancient Earth with Christian doctrine and Christian theology. So this is in some sense, it's kind of a clever new way of thinking about it, but in another sense, it's kind of the same old thing. We've heard these stories before, and I wasn't convinced. I wasn't convinced 20 years ago when I started looking into theistic evolution, and I'm probably not going to be convinced now. Maybe I'm stubborn. I don't know. Probably a good thing. So, Paul, let me tell you, actually, this next interview, you're going to know a little bit about this. So I had a little fun conversation with Neil Duran. We tried to wade through a research project that you have been involved with, and it's, in my opinion, it's one of the more complicated ones to try to explain to people. But it kind of makes sense. So let me turn this over to Neil Duran, and he will hopefully help us figure this out. So I'm here with Dr. Neil Duran of Bryan College, and he was another one of our presenters at Origins. Thank you for being with us, Dr. Duran.
Thank you for having me.
And how about you give us a little background on your life, your qualifications, your education, so forth, all that good stuff.
All right, sure. I currently teach at Bryan College in the biology department. And prior to that, I have a bachelor's degree in geology with some zoology training, paleontology masters, and then did a doctorate in micropaleontology looking at statistical patterns in microfossils, and also graduate work in history and philosophy of science. And my interest here is both biological, geological, and statistical. So lots of interesting things here.
Yeah, you're kind of a Renaissance man there.
At least Renaissance interest.
Yeah, there you go. So maybe some of our listeners and viewers don't necessarily know what what does a microfossil? What is that? What is micropaleontology? What is Is it like a microscope? Are you looking at things under a microscope?
It's the little guys.
Yeah. Okay.
The little guys are really important, and what you might do literally is you can look through a light microscope, much like you could in any biology lab. And some of the critters I looked at were about sand grain size. They might roll around under the microscope. Actually, some of mine look like little ping pong balls. You have other microscopes. You could do it with oil immersion, which means really, really small. I didn't deal with those as much, but a variety of things. A lot of things are very small, but really, really helpful in understanding the fossil record, because as much as I like dinosaurs and the big things, we don't have a whole heck of a lot of them.
Right. We all love dinosaurs. So these are not dinosaurs, these little creatures. What are these little creatures? What would you call them? Do they have names?
Yeah, you're looking at things that are basically, they're amoeba with shells.
Oh.
Foraminifera, radiolaria. Those are the microfossils, sometimes algae. Those are the ones you're going to look at under oil immersion microscopic lenses. And mine would come out of the deep sea drilling project or ocean drilling project, the newer version. And again, those are dry, and you could just put them in a little pan under the microscope and just kind of roll them around there. And they just sit in there with a paintbrush and count and catalog and do lots of neat statistics.
You have one of the more complicated projects that I heard, and I get it, and I'm trying to think how we're going to communicate this well. How about you give us like a very, very short summary of what you did? What was it that you were trying to do, and what was the point of that?
Oh, I think you want me to speak English.
Yeah, I hope you can speak some English so that everybody else can understand, yeah.
All right. And so I won't even give the title of the talk. What I want to do is I want to understand those fossils that have shapes and appearances that appear in an evolutionary order when you look up a rock section. So in other words, as you look up the rock section, they seem to be following a series or a trajectory that looks like what we call an evolutionary transitional series.
So let me see if I understand. When you say a rock section, you're talking about the different layers of the fossil record.
Yeah, different layers.
Okay.
And so it could be as broad as a big section of the Grand Canyon, that kind of spatial type of scale, or for some of them, it might be a bit smaller, maybe something on the order of something you might see on a roadside in Cincinnati, that kind of depth, but you can still see those layers.
Yep.
And now, at the same time, just to clarify, these fossils were not necessarily found, and probably were not found in the same section that way. So some of these are scattered over a big space, but when we put them back together, it seems that they would have reconstructed themselves technically kind of in a series, if you will, based on how we map the rocks. We know that A is underneath B, which is underneath C, which is underneath D. Right?
Okay, so basically you're looking at what I think you call the law of superposition, right? This idea that you as you have multiple layers of rocks, the ones towards the bottom have to be deposited first before the ones going up can be deposited on top of them.
That's exactly
right. Okay. So the basic idea, you got a stack of pancakes. The bottom pancake has to go down first before you can put all the other pancakes on cakes.
Exactly right.
Okay. So that means if your bottom pancake has blueberries in it, then the blueberries had to be in the bottom layer before you put the strawberries on the next layer or whatever.
It is.
Okay. All right. So I'm following this. All right. So that's what you mean by the order of the rock section. Or the fossil record.
That's exactly
right. And you wanna, as I understand it, you're trying to figure out, does that match what you would expect if evolution were true? Is that kind of right?
Yeah. What this came from, the thing that motivated this was my interests were very similar to Paul Garner. He had a little bit slightly different interests, were very complementary. Mine came from looking at dinosaurs and looking at the way that their overall body morphology seems to fall on a line when we statistically analyze. That struck my curiosity, and then I started looking at those critters to see if that lineage also followed a kind of that sequential lineage, as you were saying. And that's where this all kind of came from, because sometimes I actually did find that, and that was a little unexpected. So I wanted to pursue that a little bit more.
Were your results like a slam dunk for creation or a slam dunk for evolution or something in between?
Something in between.
Okay. So the fossil record is more complicated than anybody's thinking.
Surprise.
Yeah.
Though I have to say, when you look at it more closely, it has good explanations that are something other than evolutionary, and that was good. But also, there's a few that we just really wonder about a little bit. And I like the way that Dr. McLean said this once in one of our conversations. You come away and you think, for some things, sometimes you come away and you think, I have some questions here. It doesn't keep me up at night, but I just have a few questions about some things. And so that's kind of like where we ended up. Otherwise, I think we've got some good explanations for some patterns that we saw. But there's more to explore. There's more to look at.
So did you try to fit this into like a creation perspective? Like if the flood happened and formed part of the fossil record, did that make any difference to the way you approach things?
Well, the first step was just to clarify what we're seeing and look at the data, try and establish, first of all, is there something real here? Is there a real pattern here? And I do see where a vertebrate paleontologist, a conventional paleontologist will say, hey, look, we have something of a series of populations, if not not necessarily always a really well-defined evolutionary transitional sequence, but something general sometimes that looks like that. The second step is going to be, as you say, when we have some of those ones that are a little bit more of interest, do a little bit more study. And that is going to involve more things than just our stats. It's going to have to involve, where do these occur? What are these populations like? Are there other geological realities there? And we mentioned one in the paper. Have you talked about mega sequences on here? I don't know if that's a little bit...
Mega sequence. No, but that sounds pretty impressive, though. Mega sequences.
All right, let's just say it this way. So the audience does it. Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous. The Triassic is something that is a bit different than the other two above it, Jurassic, Cretaceous, in the sense that we can regionally, sometimes globally map units of rock, and we see them identified in bigger packages. And so there does seem to be a difference in packaging with the Jurassic, Cretaceous on top versus what's going on in the Triassic. All that to say that lends itself to things that might produce an artifact in our analysis and maybe make it look like there's more of an evolutionary situation going on than there really is. That's a terrible oversimplification, but I think it gives a little bit of an outline to what we're thinking about here. And so, in other words, this is going to require a bit more analysis and understanding of the fossil record, where things occur geographically, and so on. Each of these rock units are their own unique and interesting situation, and we have more questions to ask. It doesn't keep us up at night, but we're very curious about some things.
Good. So what are you hoping to learn? I mean, what's the point of this? What's this going to get us?
Well, I think one of the points is that when you look at the post-flood, and maybe you've discussed this before about the horse sequence, that you do have what looks like an evolutionary order that would make sense after the flood. But during the flood, you do sometimes have arrays, populations that are buried in sequences that are suggestive or point to something that looks like an evolutionary transition. And so one thing that could come of this is to know, how were things buried? Why are they buried in the sequences they're buried in? So as Paul Garner said, we don't have to always have these indication of some kind of series. We could have negative series or instead of positive series. There are different ways we could do this, but we do sometimes have these sequences that look suggestive of some kind of an order. And so for me, one of the things I'm interested in, I studied the Cenozoic, the post-flood, and when I look at the fossil record, I'm curious about, how were things buried basically? How were they buried? Is this purely a geographic question? Is there something else with tectonics, how the plates have moved, or how fauna were distributed prior to the flood? We think course, has something to do with that, but we'd like to understand a little bit better exactly how is that? How did that work?
Okay, that is very impressive. I mean, it's a pretty exciting project, I think, and yeah, it has the potential to help us understand a lot about the fossil record and a lot about how it relates to the flood, how it relates to organisms repopulating the Earth after the flood. So,
exactly, I'm
looking forward to more. I'm looking forward. I don't know. I hope it may continue to be very complicated and hard to interpret. Given what I have learned in my life, that's usually how things go.
As you pull one thread, sometimes
it all comes apart, and then how does it go back together? I don't know. Yeah. So tell us a little bit about the Origins Conference. Why do you participate? What's the value of doing conferences like this?
Well, I'm excited by the fact that you and I were at the beginning of this a long time ago.
That's true. Yeah.
Started with a little internet group.
Yep.
And now it's steadily grown, and we're getting more and more interesting things and better discussions, I think, over time. We're adding a theological society now, of all things. We added a geological society in 2008, I believe.
Something like that.
And so things are growing a bit. I'm also excited about the fact that we have some students that are coming, and so we can introduce them to the next generation of creation research. Maybe some of the people that are listening now are going to get inspired to do that. I'll talk to young people sometimes and just see their excitement. That's always really inspiring. And we need people to come along and take our place and help us along and jump in and help with some of the analyses that we're doing. Ask good questions. And in any kind of science, as your community grows, you ask those questions. You publish it, you move on to the next thing. That's really historically what has happened in the sciences.
So one last thought here. Let's pretend I'm a student. I'm listening to this. I'm in high school. I want to become a micropaleontologist and study with Dr. Duran. How do I learn more about your institution? Where can I find out more information?
All right, you can go online. You can go to Bryan College, look at the website, contact me, find my email address there, and or come to a conference and just talk to one of us.
Absolutely, yeah. It's a pretty exciting time because you do get into these projects that are sort of connected around the world now. We didn't have anything like that when I was in school, so
no.
It's a pretty exciting time to be a student. And yeah, I'm looking forward to lots of future work. Well, thank you, Dr. Duran, for being with us.
Absolutely.
Yes, so that was really interesting, and as you mentioned at the beginning before the interview, this was a research collaboration that I've been involved in with Neil and also with Matt McLean. And what we're hoping is that this research project is going to shed some light on some very interesting questions that we have in creationism. Things like the identification of the created kinds and possibly the location of the post-flood boundary, and in particular, maybe a better understanding of pre-flood ecologies, pre-flood biomes, and how ecological gradients in the pre-flood world were preserved by burial during the flood. So there are all kinds of sort of spin-offs, I think, within the creation model that hopefully this research is going to give us some insights into.
So let me reflect on that a bit, just to make sure everybody's getting this. So what you're telling me is you think that this kind of research is going to tell us something about the world before the flood. So if we imagine the sudden catastrophe of a global flood, basically everything that's alive at that point is going to be within, month or two is going to be buried somehow and killed. That the order and the way that happens is going to tell us something about what the world was like before the flood. Is that basically the idea?
Yeah, that's basically the idea. So if we see a morphological series in the fossil record, which evolutionists are perhaps interpreting as a transitional series, that may be telling us something about the ecological structure of the pre-flood world. And I think that's going to give us some really interesting insights into being able to reconstruct what that world was like.
So this is good. This is a great project. I've been really happy to see this moving forward, and Godspeed, and I wish you all success. May God bless this work.
And that brings us, I think, to our next interview, which is with Dr. Tim Brophy. Tim is a biologist at Liberty University, somebody who's been involved with the Creation Biology Society for a very long time. And he contributed a talk at the conference, which was really interesting, about created kinds among a group of birds called the land fowl. And as well as sort of giving us some insights into the created kinds within this particular group of birds, it also is a study that had some wider methodological implications for the whole discipline of baraminology. So that's what I talked to Tim about in our interview, and here it is now.
Well, hi, Paul. Good to see you.
Hi, Tim. Yeah, great to see you. Thanks very much for joining us today. How are you?
You're welcome. I'm very well. I'm gearing up here to start back. University starts in a couple of weeks here in Lynchburg, Virginia. So getting excited about that. So for those that don't know me, I'm Tim Brophy. I am a biology professor at Liberty University in Lynchburg, Virginia, and I'm the newly appointed director of the Center for Creation Studies here as well, building on the good work of my good friend Marcus Ross, who's done this for the past several years. So I'm super excited to be stepping into that role. I've got 5-6 research students lined up for next semester. I had been church planting for a long time, for the past 15 years, and the Lord has seen fit to transition us to focus more in a more concentrated way on creation studies again. So I'm really excited about that.
That's really great. I remember many years ago, we first met at one of these Origins conferences, didn't we? Then you kind of had so stepped away from the creation biology stuff for a while, like you say, and now you've kind of come back into it. So it's really great to kind of have you back and involved again.
Yeah, I'm really excited. One of the things, I had kind of kept my hand in it a little bit. Even though I was pastoring, I had never given up my job here at the university. And so one of the things that I had done with a student years ago was we had done a baraminology study of the land fowl. So the land fowl are in the order Galliformes, and there are 7 families. You've got everything from the Megapodiidae, which are the mound builders. The Crassidae are the guans and chachalacas, curassows, and then you have things that are more pheasant-like. You have, the true pheasants, and you have the grouse, partridges, the turkeys. Chickens are a part of that group as well. So it was an interesting group. One of the things that attracted myself and my student, by the way, is Michelle Mullis, was that there were not only good numerical data sets that we were, going to do the statistics on, but there was a pretty robust hybridization record as well. That was attractive to me because it gave us an independent way of testing the Baramins, or the membership of the Baramins. So
now let's just go back a step, because some of our listeners won't be familiar with some of the sort of terminology there.
Sure.
You mentioned baraminology. Tell us just a bit about what baraminology is. What's that all about?
So baraminology is a study of the created kinds. I'm a trained taxonomist in the conventional world, but so this has always been really attractive to me because my mind likes to classify things. And so baraminology seeks to recover, to discover all of the descendants of the originally created kinds. And it's sort of based on the notion that not only is there continuity of form within these kinds, but that there are differences or discontinuities between one kind and the others. And so instead of having a single evolutionary tree of life, we would imagine the pattern of life being an orchard full of different trees, all created by God during the creation week.
Okay, so Baramin basically comes from the Hebrew, doesn't it? So bara is create, and min is kind. So it's create. Right. It's the study of the created kinds, basically.
Exactly.
And you also mentioned their hybridization. How does that kind of play into how we identify the created kinds then, Tim?
Well, generally, we make the assumption that if 2 species can hybridize, that they're part of the same created kind. Hybridization is not an easy thing. It sort of speaks of holistic similarity. We would even say genetic relatedness. between two different species. So we can kind of start to build these created kinds using hybridization. We can do some of that same thing based on morphological similarities to start building these created kinds, but then we can use morphological dissimilarities or differences to separate one created kind from all of the others. So at the same time in baraminology, we're looking for continuities, similarities to build group, but we're also looking at differences or discontinuities to break groups apart from the others. So we're looking for continuity and discontinuity at the same time.
Okay, that's great.
Yeah.
And so you said that the group that you were particularly interested in were the land fowl, and some of the birds that you mentioned there, I'm obviously familiar with. Some of them I'm less familiar with.
Right.
So you're trying to basically work out what are the boundaries of the created kinds in this group of birds that you're interested in. And you mentioned that there was an earlier study that you did some years ago with your student.
Right.
Could you just tell us about that study? Because I think the study that you then presented this year at the conference was a kind of follow-up to that, wasn't it?
Right. So the study we had done years ago, but which, by the way, for different reasons, is going to be published very soon in the Journal of Creation Theology and Science. So we have this order, Galliformes. It's made up of two suborders, the Crassoidea and the Phasianoidea, 7 families amongst those two suborders. And the statistics alone, we use the original methods called BDIST, MDS. The original methods alone came out with 4 different created kinds within this group. However, when we considered the hybridization, it joined some of those statistical created kinds together so that we came out with just 2 of these holobaramins or created kinds. So that to me kind of showed how valuable the hybridization was, and that it could sort of mold and kind of, we could modify the statistical conclusions and sort of consider stats and hybridization together. So we came out with 2 created kinds. It was these mound builders, which are just very different. They're building mounds that will then incubate their eggs as the debris or whatever heat up. And then you had everybody else, all of the Phasianoidea, that one suborder. And then the one surprising result was that the Crassidae, which are in the suborder Crassoidea with the mound builders, actually hybridizes with many or several of the Phasianoidea. That was a bit surprising. So we really checked really hard. We got the original papers that were in Portuguese from Brazil. And sure enough, there's just some really good, reliable record of hybrids with the Crassidae and the Phasianoidea. So that was a bit of a surprising result, but it joined them with the Phasianoidea group. So that was the original study. We came up with 2 created kinds, and that was sort of a satisfying result for us.
That's good. And using both the statistical methods alongside the hybridization, I mean, it just goes to show, doesn't it, the value of using multiple different methods to sort of as a kind of cross-check on your results.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so this new study then that you presented this year at the Origins conference, tell us about that.
Yeah, so last year at Origins 2020, I heard Dr. Todd Wood talk about some new methods that he was proposing in this new package he was calling Barclay. And it was sort of based on some critiques that he had gotten from Colin Reeves. And by the way, that set of papers just came out like 3 weeks before the Origins 2021 conference. He was making some improvements to the methods, Dr. Wood was. And so as soon as I heard him say that last year, I knew that I had to do, the study just kind of fell in line in my mind as I was listening to him. I didn't know that that's what he was also doing for Answers Research Journal, but it just made sense to me to line up the methods side by side. So the original methods use a method called Pearson BDC, or baraminic distance correlation. The new method utilizes a non-parametric correlation called Spearman correlation. So I was going to line up Pearson versus Spearman. The new method also introduced some new clustering techniques called PAM and FANNY, so medoid partitioning and fuzzy analysis. So I also set out to compare the original Pearson methods, Pearson BDC with Pam and Fanny as well. And all of that also including what we call multi-dimensional scaling. That's a part of the old method and it's still being utilized. And so I was just sort of going to side by side compare those. When I heard Dr. Wood speak last year in 2020, I was a little bit concerned. I thought, oh no, are we going to have to throw out all of our old results? I mean, if that's what the data showed, and if it was shown that this old method was that bad, well, then that's what we would do. We would reanalyze. But that was my sort of initial gut reaction is, well, are these older methods still valid? And basically what I found is that the older methods and these new and improved methods, and I think by anyone's approximation, the newer methods are better. Pretty much they were very, very similar. Pearson and Spearman DDC were very similar, get very similar clustering patterns. There was one difference that I noticed. The Spearman BDC tended to give greater amounts of significant positive correlation, so greater amounts of continuity within groups, and lesser amounts of significant negative correlation or lesser amounts of discontinuity. Now that was, I didn't know until 3 weeks before Origins 2021 that was also exactly what Dr. Wood had found. He found very similar clustering patterns between the two barometric distance correlation methods, but he found more significant positive and less significant negative correlation. Now, what was cool for me, since I had the hybridization as an independent measure of the groups, is that those lower amounts of significant negative correlation and greater amounts of significant positive correlation were exactly where I would have predicted them to be based on the hybridization. So not only did I see that the two methods were very similar, but they actually, in our case, strengthened our modified hypothesis, which was considering both stats and hybridization alone. So that was very satisfying for me. And I think that's one thing that our study had that Dr. Wood didn't, was the addition of hybridization gave us an independent test of the value of these new Barclay methods. We also just very quickly found that both Pam and Fanny, the clustering techniques, were recovering very, very similar. I mean, the exact same clusters, and also clusters had the same taxonomic composition. The methods to me look very similar. I concluded that Barclay is better because it's more statistically sound, but that the older methods also have some value in helping us to recover these originally created kinds.
And this is very reassuring, isn't it? Because, as you say, it could be that if we sort of look at these new methods that we end up coming up with very different results, and then we're kind of thrown into disarray, aren't we?
Yeah.
And maybe in the position of having to reevaluate everything that we've been doing in baraminology up to the present time. But the fact that the results are coming out broadly similar, there are some differences, but broadly kind of confirming the earlier results, that's actually very reassuring. It gives us some confidence, doesn't it, that what we're doing is, has some validity to it.
Yeah, it sure does. Like I said, I sort of breathed a small sigh of relief that everything we've done up to this point was not worthless, but I was also very, very happy for Colin Reeves's critiques, because I think what it did is it made our methods better. We've got, I like some of these newer methods because there are objective ways of saying that this clustering pattern is better than that one. We're getting these numbers that say, 3 clusters is better than 2, which before, with the BDC and Pearson BDC and the multidimensional scaling, there was no objective measure of which pattern was better. So I really like that as a taxonomist. I like having some numerical value to attach to the various clustering patterns. So that's reassuring to me.
Sure. So Tim, just kind of explain to us, how does this sort of all fit into the broader creation model? Because I guess some listeners are going to be listening to this and they're going to be thinking, well, I'm not really very interested in what are the created kinds of land fowl. Why should creationists be doing this kind of work? What kind of questions can it help us to answer, and how does it help us to build the overall creation model?
Yeah, well, for me, I'm sort of a taxonomy nerd. Like Adam, I like to name things. I've done some of that with turtles and salamanders in my conventional work. So I just sort of geek out on that. I like to I just like to know what it was that God created originally. I think there's value to that for us to be able to somehow see into his mind a little bit better how he created things originally. That's, for me, that's just cool. And some of us would say that there's a pattern that life forms. I mean, Dr. Wood wrote a book called Understanding the Pattern of Life. And, some people would get more or less into that idea, sort of in a Romans 1:20 kind of way, that creation speaks to us of the creator. And so I think if one day we recover all of those created kinds, I think they're going to form some kind of pattern that could be meaningful to us. I don't think we have any idea what that is now. So to me, there's a lot of value in that. Some people look to just, enumerating the created kinds to answer questions like, well, how many animals did Noah have to bring onto the ark? Was that even a plausible thing? I know that Answers in Genesis has done some of that kind of work in sort of a basic way. So we can kind of come behind as baraminologists and maybe confirm or, modify some of the conclusions they've come up with in sort of a general or basic way. So we can answer questions like that relate to both the creation week, that relate to Noah's flood. I think there's a lot of value to this kind of work. For me, it's, thinking God's thoughts after him, trying to understand more about him through the things that he's made.
That's great. Tim, as we sort of start to draw to a conclusion, you've been part of this creation biology community that meets every year. Give us your reflections. What is it like to be part of that community? What's the value of being part of it? Why should people come along to the Origins conference? And perhaps just give us some reflections on this year's conference.
I've been a member, I think the group formed as the BSG, Baraminology Study Group, in the late 90s, but I was invited to the first public meeting, ironically, at Liberty University in 1999. I was just a graduate student. I was actually an undergraduate student alongside Dr. Wood here at Liberty. So he invited me along, and as a budding taxonomist, it just made sense to me right away. And what I found is just a real sense of community, being able to meet and discuss ideas with like-minded individuals that, support me. It's the true body of Christ at work. So I've kind of missed being away or just having my toe dipped in the water a little bit. And I'm really excited to come back to that. When I came back, there were just several people that have been there a long time that said they missed me, that they're glad that I'm back. And that's just, as I'm kind of, I know that having been away from it for a little while, that I'll need to rebuild some of those relationships and maybe rebuild credibility. But it was just very reassuring going there in Tennessee that I was just sort of welcomed with open arms. I'm going to be involved with some of the members' research this year. So that's just very gratifying that I found a place over 20 years ago, and that community's still here, largely the same, and really making progress in terms of building a creation model. So it's been a really great place for me to be a part of.
That's great, and it has been great to have you back and see you getting involved again. So we're very pleased about that. Tim, we really do appreciate you giving up your time today to talk to us about your contribution to the conference.
My pleasure.
So thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you, Paul. Appreciate it.
Bye for now.
Well, that presentation that Tim gave, that was near and dear to my heart. He was following up on some work that I had been doing for 4 years now. I created the software that allowed for the convenient application, let's put it that way, the convenient application of these methods to baraminology, the world of baraminology. World of created kinds. And so that was a 4-year project, and that was a massive paper that was literally just published this past summer in Answers Research Journal. And it came along with a 500-page appendix because I wanted to be thorough. Sometimes I wish I wouldn't be so thorough, but I wanted to be thorough, so I was pretty happy with that. So, and what was really fun about Tim's talk, as he was going through it, just giving this one example of the chickens and turkeys and such, he kept saying the same sorts of things that I had found in my research. So he was not privy. He did not know what I had been doing. He did not know what was in that manuscript that I sent to Answers Research Journal. This was all new to him. So to sort of get this pretty much independent confirmation of nearly every point I discovered in my own research, that was super gratifying. That is exactly what you like to see as a scientist. Is when another person comes in and checks your work and says, "Yep, that's what I found too." You feel like you must be on the right track.
Yeah.
Well, Paul, I think we've run out of time here for this episode. We need to sort of wrap things up. I want to remind all of our listeners about our ministries. Paul, you represent the Biblical Creation Trust in the United Kingdom and Europe. You also minister in the continent of Europe as well. Could you tell me more about where I can find out more about your ministry, and especially how I can donate and financially support you?
Yes, well, our website is at biblicalcreationtrust.org. And there's a donate button on the homepage where you can go and find out all of the different ways to give. And you can also sign up to receive our newsletter. There's a request prayer letter button, I think, on the homepage as well. And we're also on social media, so you can find us, particularly on Facebook. We're quite active on Facebook. So go and, sign up to get our prayer letter. And if you're able to, we very much welcome your donations as well to help support the work that we do. And
Core Academy of Science, the other sponsor of this podcast, we are found at coresci.org. That's coresci.org. You'll also find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and you can interact with us there. And you will also find our podcast there, Let's Talk Creation. We're on all the major social media platforms and all your favorite podcast sources. We're there too. Leave a like if you can. Leave a review. Give us 5 stars, 10 stars, whatever it is they let you do. Give us all the stars. We want all the stars, yeah. So thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time when we finish off discussing Origins 2021.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Let's Talk Creation. If you have questions, send them to podcast@coresci.org. That's podcast@coresci.org. And be sure to let your friends know about Let's Talk Creation. And check us out on social media. Thank you.